Up over my head, I hear music in the air. Up over my head, I hear music in the air. Up over my head, I hear music in the air. And I really do believe, yes, I really do believe change is coming out there. Up over my head, I see justice in the air. Up over my head, I see justice in the air. Up over my head, I see justice in the air. And I really do believe, yes, I really do believe change is coming out there. Up over my head, I see hope is in the air. Up over my head, I see hope is in the air. Up over my head, I see hope is in the air. And I really do believe, yes, I really do believe change is coming out there. Up over my head, I see changes in the air. Up over my head, I see changes in the air. Up over my head, I see changes in the air. And I really do believe, yes, I really do believe change is coming out there. Up over my head, I see love all around us. Up over my head, I see peace everywhere. Up over my head, I see sheer determination. Up over my head, I see joy. I see justice up over our heads. I see healing. I see hope up over our heads. I see power to the people over my head. Up over my head.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another It's Kairos time with the Kairos Center. That was our dear, dear sister comrade, Leslie Wilson, from the New York State Poor People's Campaign, a national call for more revival, singing Up Over My Head by Betty Mae Fikes, who was a leader in the SNCC Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And we just want to send lots of love to Leslie and her mother, who she's visiting in Virginia right now. So thank you so much, Leslie. So again, a Kairos moment is a time when crises and opportunity collide and the possibility of something new can emerge. Thank you so much for joining the Kairos Center for our bi-weekly series, 30-minute talks with our partners, collaborators, movement builders, as we discuss what is happening in the world and how we are responding in this Kairos moment. Tonight, we are joined by Dr. Jean Theo-Harris, the author of and co-author of numerous books, articles on the civil rights and Black Power movements, the politics of race and education, social welfare and civil rights in post 9/11 America. Her biography, The Rebellious Life of Mrs. Rosa Parks, won a 2014 NAACP Image Award, the Letitia Wood Browns Award from the Association of Black Women Historians, and was named one of the 25 best academics titles of 2013 by Choice. Her book, A More Beautiful and Terrible History, The Uses and Misuses of the Civil Rights History, won the 2018 Brooklyn Public Library Literary Prize for nonfiction. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, MSNBC, The Nation, Atlantic, Slate, Salon, The Intercept, The Boston Review, The Chronicles of Higher Education, and I'm sure so many more. Dr. Theo Harris is also a comrade in our struggle and the sister to our executive director and co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, executive director of the Kairos Center and co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, A National Call for More Revival, Reverend Dr. Liz Theo Harris. And thank you all again for joining us tonight to talk more about this biography of the incredible, the courageous, the rebellious Mrs. Rosa Parks. And so we will soon be joined by Dr. Theo Harris to talk more about this, her biography and this incredible new documentary that came out on Peacock. Pauline, I know we both enjoyed checking out this documentary. Yeah, we've been talking about it so much. I don't know, like, what struck you the most?
I think, in preparation for this, and Dr. Jean will be with us in just a little bit, but, in thinking about how, like, Rosa Parks saw herself in youth organizing throughout her whole life and saw herself as a part of the tapestry of what was happening through the different, conditions that she was kind of living through, that this was a lifelong work, that the Highlander Center played a huge role in her development. But yeah, just a little bit about, I don't know, that's what really struck me about everything with her work, is just how she was consistent and really saw herself in others. I think that was a big takeaway for me.
Yes, definitely. I agree. I feel like when we talk about, both of us as organizers as well, and the Poor People's Campaign, A National Call for More Revival, when we talk about the original Poor People's Campaign as it was developed in 1968, we often refer to the fact that the campaign was a lot in response to the civil rights movement and some of the limitations of that movement that folks felt with, the passage of civil rights and desegregation. And I feel like we often leave leaders like Mrs. Rosa Parks in this one moment in time, in this one action of this bus boycott that occurred in December of 1955. But really, good evening, Dr. Theo Harris. Thinking about this evening about Mrs. Rosa Parks as a leader who was developed over decades and many, many experiences, both originating from her personal development as a poor young person growing up in the South, as well as the development that she experienced through being in and engaging in the struggle, as well as the impact that she had on the development of many leaders, not just of the civil rights movement as we know it, but the movements that were to follow. I think up into today, many of the leaders that we have were influenced in one way or another by the leadership of Mrs. Rosa Parks. And so I wanted to start off this evening, Dr. Theo Harris, with talking about something that we say often in our movement within the Kairos Center and also within the campaign, of this idea that movements begin with the telling of untold stories. And so wanting to, talk with you about why, I mean, obviously there's so many reasons, but, why we as folks who are organizing must know the real story of Mrs. Rosa Parks as a leader in her development and who it has benefited by the mistelling of the leadership and participation in the struggle of Mrs. Rosa Parks. I'm sorry, you're on mute.
It's so great to be here. You can hear me okay? Okay, good, because I had to switch to my phone. So anyway, I think the story we get of Rosa Parks isn't accidental, right? And she's pictured as accidental, right? She somehow stumbles into this role. Then we have a kind of newer myth, which is, oh, she's a NAACP secretary, and it makes it seem like a really passive gendered thing. And I think we get those stories because they deprive our imagination of how movements actually work, of how these kinds of history-changing stands, where they actually come from. You may remember for people on the call who are old enough, when she dies and George Bush decides to put a statue of her in Statuary Hall, he talks about her as a candle that lit the darkness, and then basically injustice once revealed is, then couldn't stand. And that's a very nice way to think about how things work, but it's not actually the way things work, right? But that's the story in many ways that we get. She sits down, somehow there's a movement, and then it succeeds, which both deprives us, Sierra, as you're saying, of that whole history that leads her to that moment, the whole history of how the community is at a very different breaking point at that moment. And then what it actually takes to make this successful boycott. And I think that's where the lessons are in terms of for us today, in terms of both understanding that history, but that history really then shapes how we imagine what change is going to look like and how it works today.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and what I love so much too is the telling of the story of Mrs. Rosa Parks not only grows our understanding of her, but grows our understanding of, like you said, the way that movements work, the way that leaders are developed, the way that people organize, and also in turn lifts up so many other leaders that we would have never have maybe known about or may have not known about in the fullness of who they were. And I wanted to turn a little bit to that. If you could talk about some of the experiences that shaped Mrs. Parks, in the biography and the documentary as well, covering the cases, of course, of the Scottsboro boys, Reese Taylor. Could you talk to us a little bit about, I guess, the way in which our conditions shape our consciousness and how that was able to be seen in Mrs. Parks' life as a revolutionary?
Yeah. So, I think it begins when she's growing up in her family, right? That sense of pride, that sense of self-respect, and self-respect in her family means the respect you demand of other people. There's a scene both in the book, and then if people have watched the documentary, like one of her first memories is of sitting out at night. This is 1919. This is right after World War I. Black soldiers are coming back from World War I, and white people across the country are, don't want Black soldiers getting any ideas. So there are race riots from Chicago to the Klan is riding through Pine Level, Alabama, and she will sit out with him with his gun to protect their family home, as she puts it, because she wants to see him shoot a Ku Kluxer, right? So it begins at home. But where I think her idea of the possibility of a movement begins is when she meets and falls in love with who she describes as the first real activist I ever met. And that's when she meets Raymond Parks. And she meets Raymond in her late teens. This is 1931, and he's working on the Scottsboro case. And I think that moves from this sense of self-respect that she had grown up with in her family to the possibility of organized challenge. And so Raymond is part of a local movement that has grown in Alabama to protect and defend the Scottsboro boys from being executed. They're also doing things like bringing the young men food in prison. And so really it's interesting, in the beginning of their relationship, he's the more public activist and she's more behind the scenes. So I think the first thing I think we learn from that is that, like, what you can imagine, like, changes by the people you meet, right? That you can't do this alone, and you can't. And so Raymond is incredibly important to her. Then by the 1940s, she wants to become more active. We're in World War II now. Her brother's serving overseas. She wants to register to vote. And so she goes to her first NAACP meeting. She's the only woman there. She's elected branch secretary that very first day. So we can see, but she makes it known she wants to register to vote. And then I think the second person who's incredibly pivotal, which is E.D. Nixon, Edgar Daniel Nixon, who is one of the branch's most sort of stalwart activists, and he's doing this voter registration stuff. And so he comes to her apartment to bring her the materials to register to vote. And this is really going to begin a partnership, I think, that's going to change the face of American history, because they're going to spend the next 12 years really working to transform Montgomery's branch into a more activist branch. So now we have E.D. Nixon. Then a year or two later, and we don't have this in the documentary, and one of the sad things that got cut out of the documentary are the women who mentor Parks. And the first woman who mentors Rosa Parks is Ella Baker. And so Ella Baker, in 44 and 45, is the director of branches for the NAACP. And she's going around and she's giving what are like adult leadership training workshops. And Nixon and Parks go to one in Atlanta. And so this is, and so in Baker, Parks sort of sees, this woman who is this, like, consummate organizer and activist. And so it expands what's possible there. Then if we fast forward a decade, so they're trying all sorts of things, right, around voter registration and around what we would call criminal justice issues, both cases like Scottsboro, like Jeremiah Reeves, wrongful accusations against Black people, and particularly Black men, and then cases where the law isn't protecting Black people and particularly Black women. So that's like Reese Taylor, Gertrude Perkins, Black women who've been raped or sexually assaulted and there's no justice. And they keep trying and they keep trying, and like nothing's changing. And she talks a lot in this period about how it was hard to keep going when all her efforts seemed in vain, and how she felt crazy, and how hard it is to be a troublemaker. A lot of her personal writings, and you can go to the Library of Congress. Some of her papers are at the Library of Congress, and some of these writings are there, and you can see them. And so I think there's something useful about seeing that somebody like Rosa Parks spends a lot of time feeling like she's crazy, right? And feeling like, this is really hard. And her spirit is getting, we would call it burned out. She's, and she, starting in 1954, she's working at the biggest department store in Montgomery Fair, as an assistant tailor in the men's shop, which means she's tailoring white men's suits. And then she's sewing on the side, and one of the people she's sewing for is the Durrs. And Clifford and Virginia Durr are kind of one of the few white family kind of civil rights advocates. And Virginia Durr has this long relationship to Highlander Folk School. And they are holding a workshop in the summer of 1955, a 2-week workshop on how to implement desegregation. And they have a scholarship for someone in Montgomery, and Durr recommends Parks in part because she can see how low Mrs. Parks' spirit is. And Parks talks about getting to Highlander, and we see Highlander in the film, but we don't see Septima Clark, and what it is to meet both Miles Horton, right, and to be in this interracial space, but also to meet Septima Clark, who is getting fired, right, at the time because she refuses to give up her NAACP membership. And in South Carolina at the time, you can't be a teacher or have any of civil service job and be in the NAACP. And Parks is really like, she's so in awe of Clark because Clark is so calm and so collected, and Mrs. Parks feels bitter and she feels nervous all the time, and she wishes she could have like even a little bit of what Septima Clark is, you know, that calmness, that ability to keep going. And so I think that like the role of like what other people do to like so nobody does this alone, and she doesn't do this alone. And that also that same year, as people probably know, a couple of months, like 5 months before she goes to Highlander, a 15-year-old in Montgomery by the name of Claudette Colvin refuses to give up her seat on the bus, and is arrested. And Mrs. Parks has just in the past year refounded the youth chapter of the branch because she's basically starting to give up on her generation. Like, just they keep trying things and there's just no mass movement. And so she's really putting her hopes in young people. And actually, when she leaves Highlander, they do that, like, what are you going to do when you get home, like last day at Highlander? And they get to her, it's August of 1955, and she says, there's never going to be a mass movement in Montgomery. She says, it's the cradle of the Confederacy. White resistance is so great, it's so violent, and Black people aren't united. They don't stick together. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go home and work even more with the young people, with the kids. And one of the young people that she's working with is Claudette Colvin, because she's trying to encourage like Colvin's leadership and Colvin's activism. So I think that this kind of tradition of mentorship, both in terms of who mentors Mrs. Parks, but then also her mentoring young people. So again, now we're gathering more people. And some of the young people in her youth council, the weekend after she's arrested, right? So she's arrested on a Thursday night. And Montgomery's Black community is at a breaking point. And the Women's Political Council decides to call a one-day boycott. The original thing is a one-day boycott on Monday when Parks is going to be arraigned in court. And so Joanne Robinson speaks out in the middle of the night. She's a professor at Alabama State College. She with the help of a colleague and two students, right? They get into the college in the middle of the night and they run off 35,000 leaflets that say another woman has been arrested on the bus, boycott on Monday. So again, it's like, I think another thing to see here is the accumulation, right? Like, movements don't happen, as we know, with the first injustice, right? People have to get to a breaking point, and we know this, and we've seen this, for instance, around, you know, Eric Garner wasn't the first, George Floyd wasn't the first, Michael Brown wasn't the first, right? And interestingly, she's planning a workshop that weekend for her young people in the youth branch, and two people show up, and she's really depressed. And it turns out most of those young people are out like leafleting and distributing leaflets around town. She finds this out later, but she's like so depressed that weekend because she's worried that people aren't going to do it, and that even this thing she's been working on didn't work. And so I think, I guess my final point here would be that just you don't see the moment until the moment is long done, right? Like, she doesn't think like, whoa, we're about to have like a glorious moment and movement. It doesn't feel like that. And in part, there's all these relationships and connections that have been made, and there's lots more people I could talk about, right, that are in place to turn this like incredibly courageous stand into a movement that results in the desegregation of Montgomery's buses a year later.
That's incredible. That's incredible. I think that's one of the things that I also picked up about the life and organizing of Mrs. Rosa Parks, is how she was really there wherever movement could possibly take place. She's in relationship with, folks, she's preparing for the moment. You never know when that moment's going to be. One thing that Reverend Dr. Liz Theo Harris has said is movements begin as shit shows. And so just thinking about us like needing to be ready for the moment when it comes, and how we're preparing ourselves and preparing each other for the moment when it comes. I want us, as we get into this last 5 minutes, to really think about Mrs. Rosa Parks as a creative and as an artist. We were able to talk a little bit before with Dr. Theo Harris about this, but Pauline, we've been talking a lot about how all of us as organizers, as leaders in the movement, should be engaging in the culture and engaging in our creative practices. And so thinking about Mrs. Rosa Parks as that creative, as that artist, as a part of her organizing practice, as well as just her life.
Yeah, I think one thing that it really was kind of eye-opening is hearing that Rosa Parks was a quilter. And so thinking about like what that means. And Dr. Jean Theoharis, I know we might be having some internet difficulties, so pardon me if I quote you incorrectly. But thinking about what quilting means, how we have to use every single thing. That in quilting, that we don't actually want to lose anything. And so we're not existing within, everything is about like a both and. We're not existing kind of within some binary. And so I'm going to pass it back to Dr. Jean.
We were just talking about Mrs. Rosa Parks as a creative and how that relates to her organizing practice and how she's in relation with others in the movement.
Yeah, so I literally don't know what's happening with all of my connections tonight, but so one of the ways that I think about her as a creative is through this this both metaphor and the very real fact of her being a quilter. That she's a quilter from way back, and that I think it sort of speaks to her approach as an organizer, her approach as in that part of what quilting is obviously is the ability to sort of see from small scraps the the full quilt, the ability to like use different fabrics to see the ways that different fabrics only make the pattern more beautiful. The ways I think if we were to transition out of Montgomery to the sort of second half of her life in Detroit, the ways that she really embraces Black power, and sort of sees that as kind of continuous with the quilt, not as like ruining the quilt of Black protest, but just another important square that both plays off of squares that are already there. Also, she talks about part of the practice of quilting. I think, obviously the practice of quilting starts as a way to like actually make quilts that keep people warm. And so if somebody was quilting or doing a project, people would, and they came by and, you were doing it and people would come by and friends would come by and help you and quilt on your quilt. And your friend would stop by and help. And so that approach really, I don't know, to me really seems to embody like her approach to organizing and her approach to sort of her own activism, which is this idea that if I can be useful, I'll come. And so if you need me here, I'll come. If you need me here, I'll come. And if you need me here, I'll come. And that like we need all of those different patterns and we need all of those different squares. And it's not a one square movement. And also you'll go quilt on somebody else's quilt and it doesn't have to be your quilt, right? And that approach too. So to me, that's part of how she's a creative. We were also talking right before we got on the call about her religious and sort of spiritual practice. And she is a very devout Christian. She's AME. She's, daily prayer, daily sort of Bible. But then late in life, like she's, I think, maybe in her late 70s, she starts to make this connection to this sort of Buddhist monk in California. And then they invite her to Japan and she adds meditation to her kind of daily spiritual practice, right? So this capaciousness in terms of her spiritual life, so that there was no contradiction again for her in this very devout Christian, daily spiritual life, adding meditation to that. That was just that was not at all taking her away from that or different from. It was just so that kind of both and I think all of that creativeness is always about, it's a kind of expansiveness, I think, both in terms of quilting and in terms of sort of her spiritual life.
Thank you so much. I know that you've been through having to go through it with the technology this evening, and I feel like you still showed up and shared a lot with us this evening about the late revolutionary Mrs. Rosa Parks. As we close, I was just wondering if you wanted to share next steps for folks to learn more about this revolutionary. Obviously, there's your book and this, Peacock documentary, but anything you would like to add?
Yeah, so the other thing that I'm really excited about with the film is that we have built a whole curriculum around it for educators of all sorts. And you can find the curriculum at Zinn Education Project. If you look under campaigns, it'll say Teaching Rosa Parks. And there's a whole bunch of different lessons. And I think, in different ways, so how it shows us kind of the struggle in the North, how we can look at sort of the law, like lessons around critical thinking and the ways we tell these stories, in master narratives, and the way we tell the timeline and what is missing. So I would definitely recommend, and if you have educators in your life, to pass that along, because part of it is, again, like where we started tonight, the myths we get of her deprive us of being able to imagine sort of how struggle actually works, how movements actually work. And so to give us a bigger vision of her and the boycott and the Black freedom struggle is about then being able to imagine what's possible today. My book is also, I have a young adult version of it too. So, so there's really something for everyone.
That is so cool. This is Rosa Parks. This is Rosa Parks. Well, thank you so much for your time and for sharing this incredible revolutionary with us, and for, of course, always being in our corner with the Kairos Center. And thank you to everyone who was able to tune in tonight for this session. We will be back in a couple of weeks with the next It's Kairos Time. So, good night.
Up over my head, I see changes in the air. Up over my head, I see changes in the air. And I really do believe, yes, I really do believe change is coming out there. Up over my head, I see love all around us. Up over my head, I see peace everywhere. Up over my head, I see sheer determination. Up over my head, I see joy. I see justice up over our heads. I see healing. I see hope up over our heads. I see power to the people over my head. Up over my head.